Good morning. Welcome to our virtual video training. We try to have these out in the field as often as we can, but following 2020, as we all know, we ended up doing a lot of videos, and that led us to this idea, which we actually kind of like. As we all know, we're in an industry that sometimes has turnover, and we have new staff that come in. So rather than have to go out and do an entirely new training, we thought, why not try to capture this training on a video? That way, when we have a new maintenance director that comes in, you can have a link to this video and watch the video and not have to wait for the next bigger training. So with that said, we're going to tell you a little bit about Providence Consulting and Design, who we are and what we do. We are here to be your partner in physical plant, maintenance, life safety, anything that has to do with the building itself. That's what we do. So a little bit about my background. I've been in the senior living space now for over 20 years. Many years ago, I was in the trades world. I have my electrical license, my electrical contractor's license, my journeyman HVAC license, my mechanical contractor's license, my general contractor license, and then later I went back to school and obtained an MBA with a specialization in healthcare policy. So I've, for the most part, spent my entire career meshing constructions, trades, the engineering world in the senior living space. So with that said, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of our team members. David Booth here is, David and I go back 20 years. David and I have worked together for a long time, even prior to Providence Consulting and Design. David and I we used to be with one of the largest nursing home chains in the nation. David was one of my regionals in that role. And then we have Travis. Travis and I met Travis actually on a project in Memphis, Tennessee, 4 years ago. So Travis and I have been working together for 4 years. Travis, as well as David, both have been in the same situations, the same buildings like you guys have been. They've been maintenance directors, they've been environmental service directors. I've actually been a maintenance director. So we have all, for lack of a better term, we've been there, done that. We've been in your shoes, we understand and we recognize those challenges, and we want to be your partner. We want to help you do your job at the peak of your possible ability, and we feel that we have a wealth of knowledge that we can offer you and the team. Travis, like we said, has been with me for 4 years. You've been in the senior living world for
almost a decade.
Over right at 10 years. Travis also has a background in HVAC, mechanical as well, but primarily in the senior living space. So with that said, Travis is going to kind of take the lead on this video. You guys will probably see me popping in and out quite frequently. To be honest, I find it hard to not chime in. David, on the other hand, is a little bit quieter. David brings a lot to the table, but David is perfectly fine sitting over here to the side and just adding input from time to time. So with that said, we are going to go straight into our training video. And please keep in mind, even though this isn't currently interactive, as you watch this video, pause it, write down questions. We have an email address that we will share with you later on in the video. Anytime you have any questions, not only with this video, but even in your day-to-day operations of your building. If it's not an emergency, as you can imagine, we work with buildings similar to yours in over 30-some states right now. I think at last count it was pushing 36 states. On any given day, we're interacting with hundreds of buildings, literally hundreds at last count. At one point in time, it was over 300 buildings that we were interacting with on a daily basis. So as you can imagine, 300 buildings giving us phone calls all at the same time can be rather chaotic. If it's not an emergency, we would prefer that you use our work orders email address. That will come to our office. We will then look at the question. Hunter, who is behind the camera today, kind of runs all of our operations here at the office. He will then send that question out to the most fitting and appropriate person to answer your question, whether that be a daily situation, whether that be the checking of a pricing on a PTAC or a water heater. We're here to be your support in doing your job. So with that said, David and I will step out of the screen for now, and Travis will take over and start our training.
All right, thanks guys. All right, so as Mitch mentioned, my name is Travis Neal. I started in the industry about a decade ago in a skilled nursing facility in Horn Lake, Mississippi. I went from there over to an assisted living building in Memphis, Tennessee, and then finally to a CCRC also located in Memphis, where, as Mitch mentioned, I met him on a large-scale interior reno project. My history in HVAC and also wood craftsman, minor electrical and plumbing, so I was a DIY guy to begin with when I met Mr. Abrams and went into the long-term care world. So with that being said, we can get started and go through our slides. Again, as Mitch mentioned, if you have any questions, as you see a slide come up, by all means pause the video, write them down, and we'll provide you with an email address that has to be listed now. So again, as Mitch mentioned, please give us a call if you ever have an emergency at your community. We'd like to reserve that time and availability on our phone for people who desperately need it. So if it's just a basic question, by all means forward that email to workorders@pcd-corp.com. Again, that goes to the office, in which case it'll be dispersed to the best team member to assist you. And expect a reply briefly or shortly following. With that being said, we'll jump right on into your sprinkler systems. Typically you have two types, your wet and your dry system. The distinguishing factors, of course, is the wet system is indeed wet. Your sprinkler lines are filled with water continuously and pressurized either by a pump or by Natural City. The other is your dry, in which case it is a dry system with compressed air inside your sprinkler system above the riser and controlled by a flapper valve. So therefore, if a sprinkler head were to pop, the pressure is released and therefore water will follow. All right, and one thing to mention is we have just a generic breakdown of the intervals of the inspections for each system. Now we will dig deeper into each system as we go along through our presentation. And I'd just like to add that there are several types of different sprinkler heads. It's not like the movies where one sprinkler head deploys, they all start following and you before long have a flooded building. So if you're new at being a maintenance director, don't worry about that just yet. We have you covered and we'll get to that momentarily. So let's go and dive into the required life safety inspections. There are numerous mechanical and electrical devices in your community that we're going to cover. And again, we can go into greater detail, but we're just going to skim them over for right now, and we'll hold that for later in the presentation. Your fire alarm control panel is tied directly into your sprinkler system and has what's known as an audible alarm or a sensory alarm, and that will trigger and will always show on your fire alarm control panel as a trouble. If you have an active alarm, such as an actual fire or a head that has popped, a switch will throw a signal, and that will be known as a fire. So if we could, we'll go further into it. Along with your fire alarm control panel, you have other factors into life safety inside your building. As listed, the fire extinguishers. These are located throughout your community, and you have two identifying types, your ABC and your K class. Your K class, you'll notice, will be the large silver one typically within your dietary or kitchen area. The ABC is usually the bright fire engine red, and they're located throughout the community. If ever a grease fire were to occur inside your kitchen, you should always go for your Ansel system, which we'll dive into a little bit deeper later on as well, and exit from from the kitchen area. All right. Along with the extinguisher portions of life safety, we also have the emergency lighting, in which case that should be located at every entry point, exit point of the building, throughout the hallways, and inside utility areas. That way, if power were to be lost inside your community, you can make your way around and also locate where the exits may be.
I want to just add one thing in here, especially if you're a new maintenance director and possibly new to our industry. A lot of this stuff that Travis is going through, you may be sitting there thinking, how do I know? How do I know I have to check emergency lights? How do I know electrical inspections, fire dampers, etc.? That's another one of the services that we offer to all of our partners and our clients that we work with, is the TELS monitoring. So if you're not familiar with TELS, we will also be able to give you a video training very similar to this one on how to use and utilize TELS. So per government mandates and per CMS mandates, you have a certain amount of items, such as the sprinklers, the fire alarms, the items listed here, and the other things we'll be going through the inspection today. You have to do those at a minimum. You also have to do those on a certain set time schedule, which is set by the federal government and the laws. You can be more stringent and do more than they ask, but they will set a baseline minimums. So as Travis goes through these, and you see things like annual receptacle testing, annual fire doors, you do have things that are quarterly, you have things that are semi-annual. I don't know if you caught it or not, but on the sprinkler heads, you have some heads that are due 5 years, 10 years, 20, even some 50. So clearly, we're not going to remember this off the top of our head or go back and look at a clipboard and say, oh, these were inspected 49 years ago. I've got an inspection coming up. That's why the TELS system is so important. We will also help you with that. Travis, David, as well as Hunter are extremely good at TELS. I'm not. I know the basics of TELS, but I'm not an expert in it the way they are. So keep that in mind. Don't be intimidated by all this stuff we're going over and think, how am I ever going to remember all of this? We're not expecting you to remember all this. We want you to incorporate this training with TELS, and that will then help you to be a better maintenance director. So just wanted to add that.
All right, and so we'll touch briefly on these inspections listed. Your emergency lighting, as it'll be listed later on, you have a 30-second monthly and also a 90-minute burn, which is just known as a 90-minute burn. It's actually just a 90-minute test annually. So also you'd be looking to your electrical inspections, which would involve every single outlet in your building being tested annually. That would be for voltage, for tension, and also for the correct wiring. Polarity, thank you. That can also, the little tester you can pick up from Home Depot or Lowe's, your local hardware store, for maybe $20 will assist you in completing that. Once completed, document the room's okay. Obviously, if they fail, replace them or make necessary repairs and move on about your day. And finally, the fire door inspections. You do need to be trained to complete fire door inspections. It's a very simple process, and once you finish, your fire doors will need to be inspected annually, and complete documentation will need to be provided if any changes were made to the door. But again, we can get deeper into that later. So, and finally on your fire door inspections, David and I both with Providence Consulting and Design are licensed and able to inspect fire doors. They are required on an annual basis. And just touching back real quick, if any electrical inspections are required and do happen to fail on receptacles, to replace them with hospital grade receptacles in their place. All right, one brief item we want to touch on is lockout tagout. When Dave and I do tour your building for the community assessment, which will take place once a year, we do want to see your lockout tagout. Usually it's a tackle box type deal, and I want to see a stack of tags in there along with a couple of padlocks, and of course all the locking features for different appliances or equipment around your building. And not to forget that you are properly trained on it, and you continue that training on an annual basis and sign off on it saying that you do remember, and you can continue to perform lockout tagout if necessary. All right, a few more life safety inspections we want to cover with you real quick is your biannual boiler. You could typically have a boiler for your HVAC system, or you could have it for your domestic hot water to provide to your residents. You just want to make sure that those are inspected. Typically it's by the state in which you currently reside, and they will come every 2 years just to make sure it's fully functional and safeties are active. Following that, your elevator inspections, typically done by your local municipality, will take place annually. They need to have their certificates posted inside the cab itself, as well as a copy inside your life safety binder. Every 4 years, your HVAC system will need to have its dampers inspected. Typically, you would find your dampers a part of your HVAC system if they break through a firewall or if the system is in excess of 5 tons. So you may not have any 4-year dampers to be inspected in your building, but you could always just look on your condenser, find out the tonnage, or you could simply find out through where your HVAC vents are heading inside the attic space or through walls. Finally, your generator. We all know that it's a critical part of life safety to have a functioning generator on site if local municipalities mandate. We do want to make sure it's within tip-top running conditions, so therefore it needs to have an annual inspection completed by a licensed vendor. Touching back on the fire door inspections real quick, as of 2012, within your active zones of your community, obviously smoke and fire can penetrate from one zone to the next. The fire door is the only thing that keep that at bay, unless of course you have a penetration-ridden community, which we hope you do not. These inspections are very crucial to the safety of residents from one area to the next, and therefore must be completed on an annual basis. Things we will be looking for are delaminated doors, penetrations and holes indoors, physical cracks you can see below, alongside, or on top of the doors, and for positive sealing of the doors to make sure that, again, no smoke or fire can pass through and the rated door can last as long as it's been manufactured to do. Along with the items I've previously mentioned, this next slide will show you in depth the items that we will be looking for as well. As you can see, typical mechanical hardware that would be placed in there, as well as the door itself. With that said, that concludes the inspection portion, and we'll get into PMs. But before we do, I'd like to ask Mitch to come up and say a few things.
So just real quickly, if you're new in your job as a maintenance director, or even new to the senior living space, and maybe some of these things you're hearing for the first time ever, please don't be intimidated by that. For example, the training that we're providing is set on the most stringent rules out there. The most stringent rules out there are typically in the skilled nursing world. world. In the skilled nursing world, you are reimbursed by CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. With that comes a certain set of life safety codes that you must meet on the nursing home side. Sometimes, not sometimes, on the nursing home side of things, those are known as K tags. So you will have K tags that relate to your fire systems, your extinguishers, on down the line. K tag everything if you're in the nursing home world. If you're watching this and you're in the assisted living world, the assisted living world is a little bit different. Someone may ask, well, why is it different? It's still senior living. Life safety should be life safety. True, but the way that the CMS life safety inspectors approach their life safety inspections is a little bit different than the assisted living side. The assisted living side is typically private pay money, and with private pay money, the assisted livings a lot of times are more viewed along the lines of an apartment building. So with that being said, a lot of times your local fire marshal will come out and do your life safety inspections if you are on the assisted living side of things. If you are a nursing home, you will not only get your fire marshal that comes out for his annual inspection, and typically your fire marshal inspections are far less stringent, but your fire marshal may come out and say, hey, things look great, everything's wonderful. Then you'll end up having your life safety inspection through the state, which will then dig a whole lot deeper, and they'll dig into your K tag. So I just wanted to make that clear on the differentiation between skilled nursing and assisted living or independent living. So know the space that you work in, know which tags that you're going to have to follow and stay in line with, and that will help you do your job better, and it will help you not necessarily be going out and doing a bunch of inspections based on this video, when technically you may not have to do everything on this video. So I hope that makes sense. So our next session that we're getting ready to go into, we're going to talk a little bit about preventative maintenance. The first session that we went through was on life safety items that are mandated by the state and federal government. This section is not necessarily mandated by anyone. However, in the world of senior living, once you write a policy, you then are mandated to follow that policy. And I know that may sound silly, but I'll throw a random example out. Air conditioning, filter changes. Broadly debated topic. Some people think filters should be changed quarterly. Some people think twice a year. Some people say, oh no, they got to be changed monthly. Some people may even go way over the top and say you have to change them weekly. If you write a policy that says, I'm going to change my filters once a week, and you do not follow your own policy, that can be attacked. And I know that may sound silly, but that's just the way things are. Once you write that policy, that becomes your written rules that you have to follow. So with that said, we're going to move over into the preventative maintenance side of things. Preventative maintenance is so key in taking care of these buildings and adding to the life of, you name the item. Adding to the lifespan of your roof, adding to the lifespan of your air conditioners, your refrigerators, your parking lots, your gutters. Preventative maintenance is just so key in getting the owners of the building what they paid for out of their investment. And quite honestly, back when I was a maintenance director at a building, which has now been close to 20 years ago, I took that role as something to be proud of. The fact that these owners of these buildings have entrusted you to take care of their multi-million-dollar investment. And don't fool yourself. I don't care how small your building is. If you're taking care of that asset in the senior living space, it is well in excess of $1 million. Some of you may be taking care of assets that are pushing 10, 12, 15 million dollars, and you may not even know it. So I don't take that responsibility lightly, and neither should you. So with that being said, please remember the TELS software package, which we hope you use. If you don't, we can talk to you about that. But you have some sort of a maintenance policy, maintenance checklist at your campus. If it's not TELS and if it's not electronic, at a minimum, you have a set of books that tell you what to do your PMs on. So with that said, we're not going to go down and go through every single preventative maintenance item on the list. We're going to focus on the things that we see that are missed most frequently or possibly not performed the correct way. We're not going to go down and do every single preventative maintenance because every campus is different. Let me give you an example of that. You may say, well, how is a campus different? If you've got air conditioners, you have to service and clean air conditioners. If you've got a roof, yes, that's true. But for example, Some of you may have things known as sewage treatment plants. If your building is a little bit more rural, or you've got more waste than your current municipal water lines and wastewater lines can support, you may have what's known as a sewer treatment plant. Again, I've been in this space for well over 20 years. I can only think of about 6 to 8 sewage treatment plants that I have worked with in the past 20 years. So there's no sense in having a preventative maintenance policy for a sewage treatment plant if you don't have one. Another good example is elevators. Some buildings are multi-story. You have elevators. They come with their own set of inspections to where if you've got a single-story building, they don't. So just keep that in mind. If you do hear us talking about something, or you run across something that's a little bit different in a written document or even your preventative maintenance logs, that may have been copied and brought over to you. It may not apply. Please don't just think it doesn't apply. Please reach out to us and ask that question, and we'll help you better understand whether or not it applies to you and your building. So with that said, Travis now is going to talk about a lot of the things that we notice that are missed on the PM side or possibly performed the wrong way. So Travis?
Thanks, Mitch. So again, these are the items that are commonly missed when myself or David are out in the field that we see the maintenance directors or even some of the other staff members are simply slacking on, or also that they are just critical. So earlier we touched on the Ansel system within your kitchen or dietary space. That actually is not the number one cause of fires within your long-term care community. Your first cause, or most typically, is the dryers inside your community or inside your laundry room space. With that being said, we do recommend that the dryers underneath the bottom where the return and lint collect is be cleaned out at the beginning and end of each housekeeper shift, and also that maintenance goes through at least once every 2 weeks and cleans out the ducts as well as behind the dryer spaces. Along with the washer and dryers, you might have other mechanical devices or electronic devices such as your door locks or your monitors. We do recommend that they are checked frequently, not so much to make sure that they are just properly functioning, but also because it may save a resident's life. If a resident were to leave the community and the door was not properly functioning, then that could have been easily avoided had someone just simply tested this feature.
And to Travis's point, I want to add just a couple things to that. Having been in the industry, like we said several times before now, for as long as I have, probably a couple of the scariest things that I've been involved in are what we just touched about, those top two. I've been involved in this space, like I said, for pushing 20 years. I have witnessed 4 fires. All 4 fires that I have witnessed in a facility have been related to dryers. Dryers not being clean, lint, or possibly drying things like mop heads that have a flammable chemical in those. A fire is never fun. A fire is things that we want to avoid at all costs. However, if you have a fire, that's why it is so critical and so important that your sprinkler systems work, that your fire alarms work, that your auto dialers work, because fires, especially in the laundry room, due to all the lint and the highly flammable combustible items in laundry, can just rage out of control in a matter of seconds. One of the other more scary things that I have had to deal with on your door checks. You may think this is so mundane, why am I doing this? We had a situation years ago where a client outside of Baltimore, the doors failed following a storm. I think a lightning struck something, the doors didn't end up working properly. It truly was a timing situation to where maintenance didn't do anything wrong. It was just immediately following that storm, their locking system didn't work. We had a gentleman that got out of the building during that storm through one of the malfunctioning doors, just happened to be on that hall. He was a wandering resident. The next thing you know, we have full-blown search teams. We have the sheriff involved. We have the state police involved. We have dogs tracking him. Luckily, we found this individual wandering through a field about a half a mile from the facility. One of the most terrifying things that I've been involved in the senior living space. And it all happened because we just had a door that failed. So all of these items are mechanical. Mechanical things fail. It's your job to check them, try to catch them before we have a situation or a concern to where a resident is involved. So those top 2 things, the laundry and the door checks, are just absolutely vital and critical.
On the third item for hood filters, that's the filters regarding your Ansel system that we touched on previously, located above your cooking equipment within dietary or kitchen area. These items can simply be slid out of their placement. Typically those filters are made of stainless steel and can be placed in a dishwasher or be pressure washed off. For your next item for your HVAC furnace filter changes, as Mitch mentioned beforehand, that once you put a policy in place and it is documented, you must adhere to it. So I'd strongly recommend moving forward that you could just simply say once a filter has lost its efficiency and airflow throughout the duct of the unit, it needs to be replaced. Now, however that may be, if you choose to do it monthly, quarterly, so on and so forth. Your HVAC condenser, we'll go into a lot deeper here later, but always the one thing to remember is make sure you disconnect power before beginning. And final on our list for this page would be storm drains. Just make sure they're all free of debris, as heavy rainfall, when they're clogged, can cause catastrophic damage to the building for building material, as well as possibly injure your staff or your residents.
So I'm just going to add a couple things to that. For me, some of life's hardest lessons are the ones that you experience. So in talking about the flooding, you may think, well, what's the big deal? Cleaning out a storm drain, I can do that every 3 years and we're good. Well, not really. We recently had a campus. It was a newly acquired campus. It was on the east coast of the United States. And for years and years and years, the previous management team had just neglected the storm drains. So they had filled up with, you name it. They filled up with gravel, with leaves, with dirt, with everything imaginable. So what we was running into at that building is every time it would rain, they would have numerous areas of this campus to where the stormwater would literally run in the doors, get all the carpet wet, get the walls wet. I mean, it was just a disaster. So we had to spend tens of thousands of dollars going back, cleaning out, jetting out these storm drains to make the stormwater route itself away from the buildings the way the building was originally designed. If PMs would have been taking place all along, we could have saved this building tens, if not possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars down through the years of replacing carpet, replacing sheetrock, flooded buildings, the moldy, musty smells. Those are the things where preventative maintenance is so key and so critical. We had one other situation to where your job as the maintenance directors, again, it's so vital to the operation of these buildings. We had another building out in Kansas. The maintenance director wasn't familiar with how his stormwater and his wastewater lines ran and were routed. And thank goodness they called us to go out and take a look at it before they went to the next step that a contractor had proposed. Again, a major issue, don't get me wrong, but every time it rained, the water would flood the courtyard. The water then would come in the door to the courtyard, run down the hall both directions, and they would have 50 feet of hall with standing water every single time they had a heavy rain. Luckily, we were able to go in before they spent this money, and just so you know, it was in excess of $200,000 that they wanted to spend to fix this issue. We were able to go in, look at their prints, study the building, understand where that courtyard storm drain was supposed to route. That courtyard storm drain was supposed to route to a sump pump pit in one of their mechanical rooms. Lo and behold, we found out they had a pump in this pit, which was probably 10 to 12 feet deep, that wasn't functioning. So we were able to get that sump pump functioning. Once we found the sump pump functioning, the drain line that ran outside the building we found was also full of silt and soot or dirt. We were able to storm drain that out. We rerouted that PVC pipe, and for a couple $100, problem fixed. A couple $100 versus $200,000, pretty good way to go. And that's why your job is so critical. So just wanted to share, when you're hearing these things and you think, that's mundane, I don't really know how important that is. Little maintenance items overlooked today will turn into major items, major costs, and major concerns if neglected for years and years.
All right, we'll continue on some of the most often missed. Again, we touched on the HVAC and the filters. So something else Dave and I noticed in the field are pertaining back to HVAC are the mini split systems. Those are typically found in small offices or in dining rooms or even the kitchen area themselves. Typically these are mounted above head height and therefore are just a pain to clean. And we've noticed over the years that they have been neglected and therefore caused failure. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going through. The dryer ducts we've already touched on briefly along with the rest of the laundry equipment. So again, it's your job to make sure that the ducts themselves remain cleaned.
One other thing that I want to add on the dryer duct, Travis or David, either one answer this question, but if you have a a dryer duct or a dryer vent that goes outside the building, especially on your smaller, more residential or light commercial units. The use of the flexible hose ducts like you use at your house, that can only be used at a very minimal length. If you have a exhaust pipe coming down to your unit, you are allowed to use that flex to go from the dryer just to connect to the pipe. You are not supposed to use that flexible hose vent to go all the way outside your building. It just has too many dips, too many valleys. The walls on it are too rigid, and it just is not made or designed for a commercial setting. Another thing to keep in mind, if you do have hard pipe in place, whether that be a small dryer that has a 4-inch pipe or a large commercial dryer that maybe has an 8, 10, or 12-inch, you cannot use zip screws when you put those pipe joints together. Those pipe joints have to be put together and then taped with a foil tape so that those pipes are held together. You may say, well, that doesn't sound right to me. Why would you tape something when you can screw it? Here's the reason why. Think about this. What's going through that dryer? What are we doing? Yes, we're getting heat out of the dryer and gas fumes possibly if it's a gas unit. Electric doesn't have the gas fumes, but you're still venting that dryer outside. If on that round pipe you have 3 to 4 screws sticking into that pipe, 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, however long it is, what's going to start to capture on those screws? The lint and the dust that's coming off those dryers. It's going to start off with just a little bit, but as we all know, lint it seems to be a magnet. So that screw that may start out with just a little bit of lint on it, over time is going to start to build more and more and more, and it's going to start to interfere with the flow of the air through that pipe. As it begins to interfere with the flow of air through that pipe, your drying times now become much longer because it's no longer efficient. The system isn't working the way it's supposed to. But more critical and more important than that, the lint that we have, the thing that we want to do is get that lint out of the building. The closer that lint is to the heat source, which is the dryer, the more likely you're going to be to have a fire. So there's a couple reasons why that the way that your venting pipe is put together is so critical. We want to continue to ensure that the units are functioning the way they were designed to work, but we also, first and foremost, want to make sure that we do not have any type of a fire risk due to a buildup or accumulation of the lint.
And also, as we talked about the sprinkler systems for your dry systems, to keep that flapper valve that we mentioned beforehand in check is your air compressor. Something that Dave and I come across plenty of times in the field is that the excess moisture built inside these air compressors are not properly drained and therefore close in on its life expectancy, and they go out far before they should. A couple of other items is always make sure your attic space is free of debris, cables. If any penetrations from one zone to the other are present, make sure you get those sealed up nice and tight. And carbon monoxide detector batteries, along with your smoke detectors, if you have a battery backup, should be changed every 6 months.
So one other thing I want to touch on briefly, when Travis mentioned, the sprinkler heads in the attic and free of debris, you may think to yourself, I was in the attic 4 years ago, everything looked fine, what's changed? There can be a lot change, and a lot can change quickly. So a couple of examples of how the situation in the attic can change, and it might change even overnight. Especially if you have a shingled roof or a pitched roof and you truly have an attic space. You can have a strong storm come in, you can have a wind blow, you can have things of that nature. As we all know, the perimeters of especially shingled pitched roofs will have eave vents around the perimeter, and a lot of times they'll have a ridge cap at the top. They may have an exhaust fan. There are many ways to ventilate an attic. We want air moving and exchanging in those attics, but when we open up for those attics to receive air, we also can receive possibly too much air. So if you have a storm or you have a wind that comes in, or a real windy night and it's coming in through the eaves, especially in buildings that have a blown-in insulation, you may end up seeing your insulation move and shift and blow around in your attic. It's not extremely common, but it happens. You may have a sprinkler head that is sticking up 4 to 6 inches above that blown-in insulation, ready to perform its job, but we may have a wind blow, and then all of a sudden we've got blown-in insulation over top of that sprinkler head, preventing it from functioning the right way. Not only is that a tag, while yes, we want to avoid tags, the more critical point is it is a potential fire risk. Heaven forbid we had a fire in that attic. We want to have all of our sprinkler heads exposed and open, free of debris. That enables them to trip at the appropriate time, and it also enables them to spray their water pattern the appropriate way to cover all of the area that possibly could be affected. One other thing that I'll mention with attics, please do not trust any contractor. Technically, we're a contractor, you can trust us. Outside of us, don't trust anybody that's a contractor. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen a cable guy go into your attic and he's running a piece of coax and he comes to a firewall and he's like, well, I gotta go another 50 feet that way. They have no clue that that is a fire rated wall in that attic. Can't tell you how many times I've seen them take a hammer, knock a hole in it, stick the coax through, and then maybe go through the fire rated door hatch to get to the other side. I've even seen some that's so bad to where they'll take their foot and knock holes in the sheetrock so that they can physically step through the other side of that firewall. So those are other examples of where you need to be in your attics inspecting them to make sure they're up to code, up to the standards that we want them to be for functionality and safety. Contractors in the attics, unattended, is a recipe for disaster. Every time you have a contractor go in the attic, I'm not saying you have to go up there with them and follow them through every step of the attic, but someone needs to go up there when they're finished with their job and do a visual inspection to make sure that your sprinkler heads haven't been covered up, make sure your firewalls are still intact. And I'll say one last thing on this topic in the attics. Depending on what type of sprinkler system you have, you may have the orange PVC pipe in the attic. Orange PVC is an indication of a wet system. You may have a black iron system in your attic. Black iron can be used for wet or dry. Especially the PVC pipes become brittle over time. It literally is a PVC pipe and it is under some extreme water pressure. Be careful where you step, be careful what you're doing in those attics, because if that sprinkler system busts, let me tell you, you are going to see water coming out at a rate that you've probably never seen, because the pressure on our sprinkler systems, due to the functionality that they have of putting out fires, will deliver a tremendous amount of water in a very short order of time. So keep that in mind. Yes, I need you in your attics. Yes, we all need you in your attics. Make sure all your systems are functioning. Make sure that everything is safe. But when you're up there, be careful. Watch where you step. Don't break a pipe. Don't miss a truss and fall through your sheetrock. Just be careful. Okay, we're going to switch it up just a little bit. Give Travis a break. Let him set this one out for just a second. But we talked about sprinkler systems a little bit earlier. And again, if you're new to this industry, and we were talking about things like wet and dry systems, you may be thinking, what does that mean? Here's an example of what that means. Travis touched on it briefly in our earlier slides. Wet, it is probably what you would think it is. The system's always charged with water. It literally has water at every sprinkler head. It's ready to go. So if you look at this diagram, the blue piping that we have here, which is what you'll have throughout your building, your heads are placed every so often to have the appropriate coverage. Everything you see in blue here is wet, from the water coming in up through what's known as your riser. In your sprinkler rooms in your building somewhere, you have what's called the sprinkler riser. So you have your risers that come in, you basically have your distribution that goes out throughout the building, and you have your sprinkler heads. These heads are sitting there ready to work the way your wet systems are set up. Something else that Travis touched on earlier in our training. This isn't like in the movies to where when you have a fire, all of a sudden every head in the place goes off. That's not how sprinkler systems work. Just so you know, wet systems, water is in here everywhere all the time, ready to discharge. These heads, they have certain temperature ratings and they have different functions of how they let loose or they release the pressure behind them to let whatever behind them go. Some of them are as low as 150, some of them, depending on the use and the location, maybe upwards to, 180, I think, some of them, 180 degrees. On average, just a general rule of thumb, in our nursing home setting, they're typically set to trip at 160-ish, 155 degrees. You may ask, well, how does that happen? We'll talk about the heads a little bit later in the next slide. But right now, I just want to focus on the difference between wet and dry. You may be asking yourself, how do I know what I have? The easiest way to know if you've got a wet or a dry system, in your riser room, if you have an air compressor, it may be an inline, what's called an inline air compressor, or it may be one similar to what you have at your garage or your shop. If you have an air compressor, you have a dry system. So now, that may lead you to the next question to think, how does a dry system function and why would you ever have a dry system? So, good question. We all had to learn this at one point in time, including myself. Why do you have a dry system? So if your pipes, like on this system here, go into your attic, and you've got pipes running through your attic that are possibly exposed to cold weather, and we want to avoid freezing, typically that is the main reason and the only reason that you would ever use a dry system. So now you might be asking yourself, well, if the lines are full of air, how do you put the fire out? Another great question. So you have right here what's called your dry pipe valve, or also sometimes known as your flapper valve in your riser. So the way a dry system works, your air compressor always keeps the yellow pipe, shown in this diagram, keeps that yellow pipe full of air, okay? The purpose and the point of the air is to hold back what we call the flapper valve or the riser valve. You've got air on top, you've got water on the bottom. There is a fancy engineering term that you can calculate for every square inch of that valve. You have to have a certain PSI of air pressure to hold back water pressure. But a very general approach to this is if you've got water pressure coming from the bottom, and we'll just pick a number, at 100, you have to have what? Have to have more than 100 to hold it back, right? So that is how your dry system stays dry. Your air compressor runs, it pumps air into your dry side. That air holds this flapper valve closed. The flapper valve is closed. You've got literally water on one side, ready to go, air on the other side holding the flapper valve down. The functionality of the heads are the same. So when you have a head on the dry side or the wet side that reaches a temperature, if there's a fire and it reaches 155, 160 degrees, and that head trips, that will enable whatever's behind it, whether it be air or water, to start its travel to the pipe. On a wet system, when that head trips, your water's instantaneous. It's there right now. On a dry system, you have to release the air. So when that head first trips, you will literally hear the system, it'll let out a spew of air. Once that air is released and the air is gone, we now have lost the pressure that's on top of that valve holding back the water. When that air releases quickly, your air compressor is going to come on and try to run, but it'll never keep up because now it's too late. As soon as that air is all gone quickly, the water pressure will overcome the valve. The valve then opens. When that valve opens, there is a latch inside of that valve that will hold that valve open. So it's not like if it was to ever trip, you can just go, oh, I need to go fix that head. It'll all reset itself and the valve will come back down. That's not how it works. You have to have your fire sprinkler company come out, take the face off of this flapper valve cover, release the latch, close the valve, put everything back on, seal the gasket, bring the air back up, and then turn the water back on. So that's kind of a very basic understanding of how wet systems and dry systems work. You might be asking yourself, isn't a wet system better? When a head pops, you have water there instantly. If you've got air in there, how long does it take your water to get there? Again, that is an engineering calculation. So the water coming into your building has to reach the furthest point, the furthest sprinkler head, in 30 seconds or less. All of that's done on basic math or engineering calculations to understand how much pressure you have to reach that furthest point. If your water pressure coming into the building isn't enough to reach that furthest point in 30 seconds, what do? We've got a couple things that we can possibly do. Some systems will have a booster pump. So when the unit trips, the booster pump will kick in. And again, I'm gonna pull a number out of the air. If your municipal water coming in only has 100 PSI, but you maybe need 112 PSI from an engineering perspective to reach that furthest head in 30 seconds, that booster pump will be sized and engineered to boost that pressure up to that minimum of 112 or higher so that that furthest head has water at it in 30 seconds or less. So that is kind of a generic overview of wet systems and dry systems. One of the things that Travis mentioned earlier is about how the sprinkler system and the fire alarm systems work together. They absolutely do. So you may be asking yourself, so how do they work together? For the most part, your fire alarm system is only monitoring smoke heads or heat detectors. They reach a smoke or they reach a heat, comes back, tells the fire alarm to go off. On the sprinkler system, for the most part, your sprinkler system, as far as being functional, is a standalone system. It is a pipe system that's piped, it's tied to water, it goes throughout the building. It does its job independently of the fire alarm or the smoke detection system or the panel. However, you do have some safeguards in place. So for example, this valve right here, sometimes these valves are inside the building, sometimes they may be out at your riser, you may have a couple of different ones. Heaven forbid, you had a disgruntled employee or you had somebody in the community or wherever looking to cause harm to a building and they thought, we're gonna burn that building down, but I know they've got a sprinkler system, I need to go shut it off. As soon as this valve is turned, typically you've probably seen them on your riser, it's almost looks like a steering wheel and it's what's known as a gate valve. You literally turn this steering wheel and you screw the rod in and it closes the valve. And as soon as you start to turn that valve and this moves just a millimeter or a fraction of an inch, you have a sensor right here. That sensor will immediately report back to your fire alarm to let you know that someone's tampering with your shutoff valve. So you don't have to worry or be concerned about somebody just coming in and closing your sprinkler system off unbeknownst to you. The fire alarm is going to tell you that. So you might think, well, how does it know if I have a head that goes off? Okay. Once the head trips, you also have in these risers on both systems what's known as a flow switch. So as soon as that water moves to go toward a head, whether it's in a wet system, which always has water there but no water flowing, or whether it's in a dry system, as soon as that head trips and water starts to move, you have a flow switch inside that riser. When it moves, it rises just a little, functioning similar to a light switch or a toggle switch. As soon as that switch flows and it moves, it closes a set of points that then sends a signal back to your fire alarm that we've got the sprinkler system has engaged. So that's a little bit on how the two systems, the sprinkler system, both wet and dry, communicate and talk back to the fire alarm system. So one of the key points, especially on a dry system, is to keep the system dry. That may sound very basic, but it's a challenge. Let me tell you, it is a challenge to keep a dry system dry. You may think to yourself, why? How's that happen? If you've got an air compressor that's pumping air into that system to try to keep the air at the appropriate level, you may think to yourself, well, once the air is in there, doesn't it stay the same? No, air fluctuates with temperature. You probably have seen this on your car. You may check your car's air pressure sitting still in the morning before you ever drive your car. You may have a PSI of 35. You get out and you start driving down the road. As that tire starts to heat up, that heat affects the air on the inside of that tire. What happens? The air on the inside of the tire begins to expand, because when air gets hot, air expands. As that air gets warm and it expands, the pressure goes up. Very similar in our attics. So if you have a dry system in your attic and it's 0 outside and your attic is 12 degrees, that air pressure at 12 degrees is going to drop tremendously, as opposed to it being in the dead of summer at August, let's say. It's 95 outside, your attics are 120. The air pressure at 120 degrees versus the air pressure at 10 degrees, amazingly different. So the air in your dry systems is always going up and down. The goal of your air compressor is to try to stabilize it, okay? We also, as systems age, they will start to leak. A certain amount of leaks is normal, it's to be expected. But you may have some leaks start to take place around some of your gaskets where the two pieces of pipe come together. You may even start to have some very slight pinholes that starts to come in your system, and they'll just leak a little bit of air over time. Leaks in dry systems are normal. I won't say that they're acceptable. We would love to have a totally sealed system, but the realities are in our buildings today, as old as a lot of these nursing homes are, they simply leak. That's the point of your air compressor. So we've talked about air, pumping air in. We talked briefly about one of the things that's missed often is draining the water off of your air compressors. So that air, as it's being pumped into your dry system, it's got some moisture in it. When it gets into your riser system and it gets up in your sprinkler system, that moisture literally will start to turn to water. As that temperatures fluctuate, goes up and down, you'll also have some humidity in that air that's being pumped in start to turn to water. Remember, what's the point of having a dry system? It's because it's in a
it's in a cold area and we don't want that pipe to freeze. So how do you keep that air or that water out of a dry system? You do that by something known as low point drains, okay? So throughout your building, you are going to have several what's known as low point drains. So this picture here at the top is what a typical low point drain will look like. You'll have a piece of 3/4 inch black iron coming into one side, you'll have another 3/4 coming into the other side. When these systems are designed, they are designed to pitch toward that low point drain. So if that situation takes place like we just described, that air, as it pumps into the system, it turns to water and humidity, it's designed to where that water will always work its way back toward what's known as a low point drain. So you may ask yourself, okay, so I've got water working its way back. I've got water coming down into my mechanical closet or wherever this low point drain may be located, and it's filling up this valve. As you can see right here, this bottom valve is closed, okay? So your water is going to get right here and it just starts to fill this pipe up, okay? So how do you go about draining those? I can't open it, Mitch, because if I open it, there goes my air, then I'm going to fill the whole thing with water. Yes and no. You cannot open it without closing the top valve first. So you notice how the picture up here of the actual valve, we have two ball valves, okay? One is open, one is closed. In this situation, my water could be running into this, building up in this piece of pipe, but how do I get the water out of it? I'm going to close this ball valve to isolate my dry system, then I'm going to open the other valve. What that looks like will be right here. This would be the valve that I close. This would be the valve that I close. This then would be the valve that I open. All of the water now from this point will drain out and go outside your building. You get rid of the water. You're going to do that a series of times until you no longer see or hear water coming out of the system. Depending on how frequently you do that, I would recommend at least monthly in the summer months. In the winter months. In the summer, you might get by every other month, but it depends on what your policy is. You need to go identify all of your low point drains and drain them until you have no more water. Remember, top valve closed, bottom valve open. Let the water run out of that point. Now you close your bottom valve, you open your top again. If there's still water above that top valve, you'll hear it trickling back down in. Give it a few seconds. Wait until you hear it, the trickling stops. Same steps again. Now I'm going to close the top, I'm going to open the bottom, I'm going to drain the water out. You may have to do that 3 or 4 times, especially if you're not familiar with the building and no one's done this in the past. One of the worst things that we can do is not know where our drain or low point drains are. And you may say, why, Mitch, what's it matter? If this continually is building up with water, that water can and will eventually back its way up all the way into your attic because it's never been drained and it's your low point. All of your water is going toward it, but if you're not draining it timely and in the appropriate time manner, that water is going to build back up into the attic, okay? Cold water in an attic and it's 10 degrees in the attic, what happens? It freezes. Water lines freeze. When they go to thaw, what happens? They bust. That's why we have to continually check and drain our low point valves. So, brings us to our next question. You might be thinking to yourself, Mitch, I'm brand new here. Been here 3 days, 3 weeks, whatever it may be. I've never seen one of these. Where are they at? Good question. The best way to identify where these are located on your building is to go walk the perimeters of your building. Walk the perimeter of your building. 9 times out of 10, they're going to be low. They're going to be less than 2 feet off the ground. And you're basically going to see an elbow sticking through your building, either on a galvanized piece of pipe, black iron piece of pipe, and a lot of times they'll have a 45 turned at a slight angle coming out the wall. If you've ever walked the perimeter of your building and saw this black iron pipe or galvanized coming through the exterior of your building at a 45, and you've always thought, I wonder what that is. That's your low point drain. So walk the perimeter of your building, look for these low point drains. When you identify it on the outside of the building, notate that and think, there's a med room right inside the wall there. Or, that's my mechanical room where my water heaters are on the 200 hall. Wherever it may be, go back inside your building and look for this setup to where you've got your low point drains. Very, very critical. that you keep the water drained off of your dry systems. We do not want a dry system being a wet system. When a dry system becomes a wet, one of two things have happened. You either are not draining your low point valves, or the system has tripped and we've got water in it that way. The goal is to keep a dry system dry. So enough on that. Next slide. So we talked briefly earlier about sprinkler heads, okay? So these, as you can see, basic sprinklers. The heads for the most part are the same. We'll go over this one pretty quickly. So this head here is, this glass piece is literally holding back the water. It's holding back the water with this glass tube that has mercury in it, okay? Or a chemical that is heat sensitive. If you were to have a fire near a head like this, and the fire and the blaze was coming up near this head, as that chemical gets hot, that chemical expands. As that chemical expands, it will literally bust the little glass tube that is holding this piece back. When this reaches a certain temperature that it's engineered and designed to do, it expands, the small glass tube busts, this spring-loaded head here will drop. As soon as it drops, right behind it is whatever system you have. As we mentioned earlier, if it's a wet system, right behind it's water, water's coming immediately. If it's a dry system, that head drops, it disperses the air, and then here comes the water. If you remember from our slides a couple minutes ago, water is designed to be at that head within 30 seconds, okay? Now all of a sudden you've got water spraying down, water spraying on this little star-like device on the front of it. That star-like device, yet again, it's engineered and designed for a purpose and a function. It's designed as the water comes down, it disperses the water, almost making like an umbrella that where you're literally sprinkling like a U-shape type thing upside down. Your next head is designed to be located so many feet away from it so that if it were to trip, its casting and spray, they will overlap each other so that you're able to put a fire out no matter where it is in your building. So that's kind of a quick little summary of a sprinkler head. So again, if you have any questions on the sprinkler piece, for me, the engineering and the knowing why behind the way systems function and operate, that always intrigued me. We can tell you guys as maintenance people, here's a list, go do these 14 things. Okay, maybe you will. I personally think you're going to come far more close to doing those 14 things if you knew why you were doing them. So if you knew why it was so important to drain your low point valves, now all of a sudden it makes sense. Oh, I don't want a sprinkler to bust at midnight on Christmas and I've got to spend Christmas Day in the facility because the sprinkler line's busted. No, let's do our PMs and we can try to avoid that. So we went pretty deep on the sprinkler side because, in my opinion, this is one of your more critical and important systems in your entire building. At the end of the day, this is the last resort to save us from a catastrophic loss of life. So make sure you know how your sprinkler systems work. Make sure you know whether or not they're wet or dry. Make sure you know where your low point drains are. If you have any questions on that, as we shared earlier, shoot us an email. We'll get back to you. Tell us the slide or the page that you've got a question on. We'll try to answer your question because we want you to be educated on the systems, especially the life safety systems within your building.
Now that Mitch has walked us through the suppression systems tied into our sprinkler system, now we'll go to our mobile suppression, which is our fire extinguishers. So first off, we need to learn how to properly use one, which is known as the PASS technique, which stands for pull the pin, aim, squeeze the trigger, and add sweeping motion. And my assistant Hunter here. So again, I have a small, I'm not sure the size of this one, definitely smaller than a 5 pound, but here's the pin that was mentioning. So if there's an active fire in place, you would simply remove this pin, aim at what you want to extinguish, squeeze this handle here towards the top, and add a sweeping motion. And always remember to spray at the base of the flame and never at the top, as that will be ineffective. So thank you, Hunter. All right, your fire extinguishers, that can be inspected monthly by anyone on premises. Basically, all you're doing is checking to make sure the pin is in place and that pressure is still in the green area where it needs to be. Other than that, you'll have your annual inspection, in which case your fire extinguisher vendor will come out and replace them as needed, or simply place fresh tags on them. All right, back over to the vent hood, and also, if you recall, the K-class extinguishers that we spoke about earlier being the stainless steel cover. That would be located typically in the dietary area. The appropriate actions, as mentioned beforehand, is always discharge your Ansel first. A lot of times what happens is people comes across a grease fire and they say, well, it's minute, I can take care of that myself with a K-class. It ends up being a little more than they can handle, and they still end up fleeing from the area and sometimes even forgetting to pull the Ansel chain. So always start with Ansel. I know it's a cleaning process at the end of it, but it's made there to protect the building and the lives of the occupants. Your Ansel should be inspected twice a year and cleaned twice a year. Typically, the inspector and the cleaning company are two separate people, so you need to reach out to your vendor, and also typically a pressure washing company for the cleaning of your Ansel. The final is your K-class extinguisher. Same rules apply as the other ABC extinguishers found in the hallway.
So I wanted to just add one quick thing as Travis was going over the hoods. Just so everybody's clear on how these hoods work. These hoods can work and they can be discharged or engaged in two different ways. So one, all of you, I hope, know where your emergency pull is. So you should have a pull system in your kitchen, somewhere in the close proximity of your cook line. So heaven forbid you have a fire, as Travis has already touched on. Our first avenue is our Ansel system. And you're going to learn why here in just a second. So when you go pull that device, you literally, if you look closely at that, inside of that pull station is a cable. That cable goes up, and for lack of a better term, it's like a fancy mouse trap. You pull that cable runs around, and it does several things. A couple of the things it does. One, it shuts off all of the power to your cook line, whether that be electricity or whether that be gas. So when you pull that system, it shuts your cook line down. So the source of the flames or the source of the heat is shut off instantly. When you pull that system, while it also shuts down the cook line, it also engages the suppression system, and here comes your wet chemical to put the fire out. At the same time, your hood or your system is running and it's pulling all the smoke out. All of that is tied together. One last thing that we'll touch on, the hood system will also do that on its own. Inside of your hood, you have what's known as a fusible link, similar to, I think we touched on fusible links earlier on your fire dampers, but if not, the fusible link is basically a small piece of metal. That small piece of metal has a melting point, similar to the sprinkler heads we went over earlier. When your sprinkler head reaches a designated temperature, that sprinkler head will disengage, or as we talked about on the sprinkler head, it will pop. Here comes the water. A fusible link is designed to melt. When that fusible link melts, that cable we were talking about when you pull, it basically simulates the pulling of that cable on its own. As soon as that fusible link melts, it dissipates, the cable there releases on itself, it will automatically engage all of the previous steps that we just talked about. So, hopefully, if you have a fire raging out of control, the first thing you're going to do is go pull the system. That's going to be our first line of defense. Heaven forbid the cook line stepped away to go to the walk-in freezer or to go wash their hands or do whatever, and you happen to have a fire start to rage out of control. The systems are also designed to do exactly that on their own. It may just take it a little bit longer to melt that fusible link. And if you're wondering about the fusible link, which we haven't talked about here, but we may talk about later, it's those same fusible links that are used in your attics and used on some of your registers on the ceiling. So anywhere that you have a penetration of a firewall and you've got a fusible link holding open a fire damper, same technology, same principle takes place. If that fusible link gets so hot due to a fire, that fusible link will melt, that damper will close. So the principle of a fusible link we see used quite frequently throughout all of our life safety components.
Okay, so we'll go over into the dietary equipment real quick and just touch on a few key pieces of equipment that we have. Typically your dietary staff will make sure that these are clean and functioning as needed, but every once in a while they may need assistance. So when overlooking your actual cooking appliances, your stove and your oven, just make sure there's no excess grease in place that could potentially cause a fire. And obviously make sure your seals and everything are clean and free of debris, so everything is sealed properly. Dishwasher, same thing applies. Make sure seals are in place and make sure it's just cleaned. If you happen to walk by and notice that there is debris in place, take the initiative or ask your dietary staff to go ahead and step in and clean the appliance as needed. Also, depending on where you're located in the United States, you may have a hard water situation and D-lime may be needed. That should be handled pretty frequently. In my professional experience, it's about every quarterly that the equipment needs to be shut down for at least 12 hours and D-line placed inside these areas to keep from any buildup taking place. Continuing on, your ice maker needs to be cleaned thoroughly by either the staff or yourself pretty continuously, at least on a monthly basis, and then also on an annual basis. It's not uncommon for a vendor to come in and deep clean as well. This would include emptying out the tray itself or the basin, getting all the contents out, completely stripping the system down, and cleaning every square inch of it. The fryer, obviously we want to make sure our elements are in place and fresh grease is always present. So in draining the grease itself, if your dietary staff would just look over the heating elements, make sure there's no punctures in there, and make sure that the continuity will be present through the running of the fryer itself. Refrigerators and freezers, obviously make sure your dust trap areas are kept clean and allowing the systems to remain efficient at all times. All right, now with the kitchen out of the way, we can go over to our HVAC equipment. A lot of you have various pieces of HVAC equipment. Most typically, you'll have your split systems, which is depicted here. And I'm going to walk you through the basic do's and don'ts of cleaning the HVAC system, or also the condenser outside. So obviously, the first thing we want to do is disconnect the power. That's typically located right next to the condenser itself, either by a throw switch or a removable fuse, at which point all you need to do is throw it to the off position or remove the fuse entirely. After that, we're going to take off the cover of the of the condenser, in which case a lot of time that brings the fan along with it. So always remove the screws all the way around and bring the wires closest to the motor so as not to pull the wires out of the contactor, which is further into the unit. After that, we're going to apply our solvent in and around the condenser area of all the coils. And once that's soaked in and let sit for a little while, it will begin to foam and you'll actually see debris falling out of the solvent. Then we'll come back through with a water hose. Make sure that you either have just a light attachment as depicted here or just the hose itself. By all means, do not use any pressure device. Do not use a pressure washer and try, because as that will damage the coils more so than do them any good. We'll start from the inside, again, as depicted, and work our way outside spraying the water. All the debris will be falling to the ground, and at the end of it, you simply replace the cover, screw it back into the cover, and then you resume power and turn it back on, either by the switch or the removable fuse. Inside the unit of the HVAC system located indoors is known as the A coil. As you can simply see, it looks like an A, and it is right above the fan motor, and the freon that's being circulated through the system actually goes through the A coil. Right below this A coil, which would be that right hand, is typically where your filter would be located, and what it does is prevent any debris from reaching the underside of it. But also, we'll say around once a year, we need to dismantle the system, and which is simply just a stainless steel cover over the A coil, and we'll have the system turned off of this, as we don't want any mechanical devices whirling under our arms. We'll apply the solvent on the bottom side of the A coil as the air is being pushed up. That's the area that will catch all the dust and debris. And again, as depicted, we'll scrub those areas clean. Once finished, replace the system and return power to the system. Here we have a generic breakdown of the split system that I've just mentioned. Here's your outside unit, in which case we would disconnect the power to wash the coils on the exterior of the building. There's your high and low pressure freon coming back over to the, again, A coil, as you can see here, and then your furnace and fan motor, and typically your filter is right here on the return side. So again, if you have any questions regarding the HVAC portion of this video, by all means email us and we'll be glad to go into further detail with you. All right, we'll jump over into emergency exit lighting. This lighting is manufactured to be battery backup at all time in case you were to lose power. And all we want to do is on a monthly basis, we want to check for a 30-second test, in which case I would simply go up and hit the button for the test. And as long as it illuminates for 30 seconds, it is considered a pass. If it were to fail, obviously we need to look into the bulbs or battery being needed replaced. Annually, we do a 90-minute test. The most easiest way to do that is go to your closest breaker box that's located for the area in which you're working and disable the lights in that area by throwing the breaker for 90 minutes. So an hour and a half after we started, we will return back. If any of the fixtures have blown bulbs or the battery has died in the process, we need to have those replaced immediately, documented, and then retested. All right, while we're doing other life safety checks, we want to go ahead and test our hot water. Typically, we want to keep water at no hotter than 110 degrees, but it may be vary by state by state. But on a national level, 110 degrees is recommended. And so the best way to go about testing this is go to random resident rooms and also any resident utility areas that have fresh domestic water, and just check it on a daily basis and document it. Obviously, we won't be coming in on Saturday or Sunday just to check water temperatures, but if you're there, go ahead and take care of it while you're there. Also, when taking your water temperatures, you can have your washers and your dishwashers for your clothes and for your dishes. Acceptable range for sanitary purposes is 180 degrees, but also we have detergent-based cleaners and oxygen-based cleaners that are able to reduce the temperature of the water there. If you'll notice on the inside your riser room, as Mitch was mentioning, for your sprinkler system, you'll always see at least 2 pipes going to the exterior of the building, one of which is your drain and the other is your FDC, or fire department connection. This pipe actually goes through the exterior wall and has 1 or typically 2 connection points on the outside, and we want to make sure that those are always clearly visible and with appropriate signage. So if there were to be an emergency, the fire department knows exactly where to locate it so they can hook up their hoses. Again, on an annual basis, we want to test the GFI and receptacles throughout the entire building and document them. If any issues are in place, it needs to be resolved and documented. With the exception of Missouri, in which case every 2 years a licensed electrician must come to your building, take a sample portion of your outlets, test them, and then they will send off their report to the state for approval. All right, over to the fire panel. Typically you have 2 12-volt batteries located within your fire panel, and those batteries are made to produce the electricity needed for your fire panel, strobes, and the annunciators in case power were to fail within your building. A couple of years ago, it is required by the NFPA that the 2 batteries, individually, the batteries cannot drop below 10.52 volts when in use. Now, just to clarify, when I mean in use, it's if we were to simulate a fire drill, we would leave the horns and strobes active at all times and check only the voltage. We're not interested in amps or watts. We only want to see how many volts remain on each battery. As long as it remains above 10.52 volts, while again, the horns and strobes are active, then your battery's passed. If they did fail, then they will need to be replaced and documented. All right, so that concludes this training session from Providence Consulting and Design. We hope this information has been very helpful to you. And again, if you have any questions, we can be best reached at workorders@pcd-corp.com. And again, we're here to assist you in any way possible, so please utilize us to our best abilities, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.